On 26 October 1921, in a St. Paul maternity ward, the lamplight was low and institutional, not glamorous. Steam hisses behind frosted glass. A nurse smooths a starched sheet. Zelda Fitzgerald, 21, daughter of an Alabama Supreme Court justice, blinks through anesthesia and reaches for the metal rail of the bed instead of a dance partner's hand. Outside, snow collects on the hospital ledge. Inside, her husband F. Scott is already making notes. Later, he will record the words she murmurs about their newborn daughter, hoping she will be a beautiful little fool, and transplant them almost verbatim into The Great Gatsby, giving the line to Daisy Buchanan. For Zelda, the ritual that follows is not champagne, but correspondence. A thank you note to Scott's editor, a letter home to Montgomery, a diary entry half finished. Pen scraping paper becomes her private performance, the acceptable outlet for an unruly voice. Years later, critics will celebrate that line as his. The cost of her brilliance is already being tallied in ink. On 24th July 1900 in Montgomery, Alabama, Zelda Sayre was born into a house where mahogany furniture gleamed under gas lamps and rigid manners governed every interaction. Her father, Judge Anthony Dickinson Sayre, serves as an associate justice on the Alabama Supreme Court, a position that makes him the embodiment of Southern order and legal authority. She will later describe him, in letters preserved at Princeton University, as a living fortress, a man whose presence defines the boundaries of acceptable behavior in their household. The family's connections reach deep into Confederate history. Zelda's great-great-grandfather was a Kentucky senator, and her grandfather served as editor of the Montgomery Post during Reconstruction. Respectability is not merely a value, but an inherited architecture, built from generations of careful marriages, appropriate friendships, and the maintenance of social position through adherence to codes that everyone understands but no one needs to articulate explicitly. By 1914, local society pages list Zelda among the Montgomery belles appearing at the country club, white dresses catching the late afternoon light, an orchestra playing on the veranda, the faint clink of ice in glasses as servants circulate with refreshments. After each dance, each party, each social event, she is expected to write careful thank you notes in her looping, distinctive hand on monogrammed paper, rehearsing the script of charm that transforms genuine pleasure into social currency. Her mother, Minnie Macon Sayre, corrects her posture at the dinner table with a light touch on the shoulder, reminding her daughter that a Sayre girl must sit as if watched, as if every moment might be observed and judged by an invisible audience whose standards must never be questioned. Biographers note that this household, like most privileged Southern homes, was staffed by black domestic workers, cooks, maids, laundresses, whose labor insulated the Sayre children from menial tasks and from the economic anxieties that shaped most Alabamians' lives. The family's comfort depended on structures of racial hierarchy that Zelda absorbed without apparent reflection, a foundation she would carry forward into her adult life without examining its moral architecture. Privilege here meant protection from want, from labor, from any direct confrontation with how wealth and whiteness were maintained. But it also meant surveillance, the constant awareness that as the judge's youngest daughter, she represented not just herself but her family's position in Montgomery society. The narrator observes that the girl who scribbles irreverent notes in Montgomery parlors, who arrives late to parties and laughs too loudly at inappropriate moments, is already learning the central paradox of her position. Her wit is welcome only when it decorates social occasions, not when it questions the assumptions underlying them. The letters she writes so effortlessly, filling pages with observations and jokes, will eventually outgrow the envelopes designed to contain them, becoming something neither she nor her family can fully control. In the humid summer of 1918, with ceiling fans stirring the heavy air above the dance floor at the Montgomery Country Club, Zelda Sayre encounters the man who will transform her life and claim her words as raw material for literature. Outside, infantry regiments from Camp Sheridan, the military training facility established near Montgomery after America entered the Great War, drill in the Alabama heat. Inside, a young lieutenant from Minnesota named Francis Scott Fitzgerald watches 17-year-old Zelda execute the Charleston with practiced defiance, her movements suggesting both perfect mastery of the dance and deliberate mockery of its conventions. She is already notorious in Montgomery, the youngest child of the formidable judge, known for arriving late and laughing too loudly, for diving fully clothed into country club pools, for saying exactly what she thinks regardless of whether it shocks her listeners. He is a Catholic outsider from the Midwest, uncertain about both his literary prospects and his ability to make a living as a writer, yet convinced of his own genius and hungry for the kind of experience and material that might feed his ambitions. After they dance, she retreats to the ladies' dressing room, adjusts her gloves in the mirror, then pulls a small note card from her beaded evening bag. In a few careless lines, her handwriting already distinctive, slanting dramatically across the page, she agrees to see him again. Nothing flowery or overly romantic, but enough to signal interest and invite further pursuit. Their early correspondence, later collected in Dear Scott, Dearest Zelda, and preserved at Princeton, reveals how quickly flirtation evolved into something more complex, a literary collaboration as much as a romance. He begins lifting phrases from her letters directly into his fiction, recognizing the freshness and immediacy of her voice. She reads his manuscript pages and offers sharp, perceptive criticism, understanding instinctively what works and what feels false or strained. Yet even in these early exchanges, the terms are fundamentally uneven. His officer's uniform and his literary ambitions attract her, offering the possibility of escape from Montgomery's constraints. Her social pedigree and her striking beauty and verbal brilliance attract him, providing both romantic satisfaction and valuable source material. But her family's consent to any marriage depends entirely on his ability to convert words into money, to prove that his literary ambitions represent a viable economic foundation, rather than mere pretension. The correspondence from this period shows both the genuine affection developing between them and the transactional elements that would shape their relationship permanently. Scott writes to her about his novel's progress, about his belief that success is imminent. Zelda responds with encouragement mixed with practical concern about whether he can actually support a wife. Her letters demonstrate a sharp awareness that marriage represents her best chance for leaving Montgomery and entering a wider world, but also anxiety about tying herself to someone whose prospects remain uncertain. The narrator reflects that by the time the armistice is signed in November 1918, ending the war and sending Scott back to New York without the combat experience he'd anticipated, the girl from the living fortress in Montgomery has become simultaneously sweetheart and source material, collaborator and subject. The country club has not produced a marriage yet. That will require Scott's literary success, but it has established the pattern that will define their relationship, her life and words becoming raw material for his art, her brilliance feeding his career, while her own ambitions remain undefined and secondary. By 26th of March 1920, when This Side of Paradise appears in New York bookstores to unexpected critical and commercial success, Zelda is still in Montgomery, reading the reviews with a mixture of pride and discomfort. Friends and family who know her well notice immediately how many of her characteristic phrases, anecdotes from her childhood, and details from her diary have migrated into Scott's novel, transformed but still recognizable. The romance Scott depicts on the page feels uncomfortably close to their actual relationship, the female characters bearing unmistakable resemblances to Zelda herself. She jokes about this borrowed material in letters, but beneath the humor lies a genuine ambivalence about seeing her life and words appropriated for someone else's literary success. The novel's success changes everything. Suddenly, Scott Fitzgerald is no longer an uncertain prospect but a celebrated young author, proof that literature can indeed generate both fame and income. On 3rd April 1920, barely a week after the novel's publication, Zelda arrived in New York City by train, checked into the Biltmore Hotel, and prepared for a hasty wedding. She walks up the steps of St. Patrick's Cathedral, wearing a simple suit rather than a traditional wedding gown. Her practical choice perhaps reflecting both the speed of the arrangements and her sense that this marriage represents something more complex than conventional romance. In a small ceremony with only 8 guests present, she becomes Zelda Fitzgerald, legally bound not just to a man, but to his burgeoning literary legend, her identity now permanently attached to his career and reputation. The marriage marks both liberation and a new kind of constraint. She has escaped Montgomery and entered the glamorous world of literary New York that she craved. But she has also entered a partnership whose terms are fundamentally unequal. His career is established and acknowledged, while hers remains undefined and dependent on his success. Scott's income supports their extravagant lifestyle. Scott's work determines where they live and how they spend their time. Scott's reputation provides their social currency. Her role, never explicitly stated but clearly understood, is to be beautiful, charming, and supportive, to enhance his image and provide him with material, not to pursue independent literary ambitions that might compete with his. 2 years later, in a satirical review, she writes of Scott's second novel, The Beautiful and Damned, for the New York Tribune. Zelda makes her discomfort explicit through humor. She notes that she recognizes a portion of an old diary that mysteriously vanished shortly after their marriage, a diary she'd kept private, but that now appears slightly altered in her husband's published work. Mr. Fitzgerald seems to believe that plagiarism begins at home, she writes, the joke pointed enough that readers can understand the genuine complaint underneath the witty surface. The review demonstrates both her literary skill, she writes with clarity and sharpness, and her growing awareness that the marriage contract has formalized something that was already occurring, her words, experiences, and observations becoming available for Scott's use without acknowledgement or compensation. The narrator observes that the marriage contract signed at St. Patrick's Cathedral formalizes what the manuscript of this side of paradise had already implied. Zelda's words, her life, her very self can circulate more freely and profitably under Scott's name than under her own. The Biltmore Hotel's revolving doors, where they famously play like children, spin constantly like the pages of a book she provided material for but did not sign, a book whose authorship belongs entirely to someone else, while her contribution remains invisible, except to those who know her well enough to recognize her voice speaking through his prose. In May 1920, newly married and living at the Ainaa Biltmore Hotel in New York, Zelda's education in becoming the flapper takes place not in a conventional classroom, but in the hotel's ornate lobby, under the observation of journalists, gossip columnists, and curious onlookers fascinated by the young couple's theatrical behavior. Scott performs handstands in public spaces. Zelda rides the revolving doors repeatedly until hotel staff complain, spinning in circles that suggest both childlike playfulness and deliberate provocation of bourgeois expectations. Society columns describe their antics with equal parts admiration and alarm, documenting their drinking, their late hours, their apparent indifference to convention, and building a public syllabus that defines the flapper as a new American type, young, beautiful, defiant, a woman who drinks gin openly, dances on tabletops, and treats curfews and social restrictions as mere suggestions to be ignored. Zelda participates in creating this public persona while also beginning to analyze it with ironic distance, treating the role of flapper as something she can simultaneously perform and critique. In June 1922, Metropolitan magazine publishes her essay, Eulogy on the Flapper, in which she declares that the flapper is already deceased, not a living, evolving figure, but a cultural moment that has already passed, its brief freedom having been buried under the weight of matrimony and conventional expectations. The essay functions as coded self-portrait and warning, Zelda analyzing the role she herself embodies, recognizing that the very qualities celebrated as liberating, spontaneity, pleasure-seeking, defiance, are tolerable to society only within carefully bounded limits, and that marriage, despite its promise of partnership, tends to constrain rather than expand women's freedom. Late at night, back in their hotel suite, she bends over hotel stationery to answer fan letters addressed to both of them, to respond to editors' inquiries about potential writing projects, to maintain correspondence with friends and family. The micro ritual of writing, fountain pen leaving ink stains on her cuffs, pages stacked haphazardly beside the overflowing ashtray, the scratch of nib against paper audible in the quiet hours after party's end, becomes simultaneously profession and pose, genuine work and performed authenticity. She is writing, producing text, engaging in literary labor, but the work happens in interstices between social obligations, in hours stolen from sleep, in spaces that seem private, but that exist entirely within the framework of Scott's career and their shared public image. She begins publishing short pieces under her own name, essays, satirical sketches, brief autobiographical fragments that magazines are willing to purchase precisely because they offer readers access to the woman behind the famous Fitzgerald marriage. The pieces demonstrate real literary skill, sharp observation, vivid prose, and ability to convey complex emotions through seemingly casual anecdotes. But they are also constrained by genre and expectation. She can write about being young and beautiful and married to a famous author, can describe parties and fashion and social life, but cannot easily claim space for more ambitious literary projects that might compete with Scott's novels and stories. The narrator observes that, publicly, Zelda perfects the role that Scott and the magazines have collaboratively written for her, becoming the definitive flapper whose image appears in newspapers across America. Privately, her essays reveal a young woman studying the part she is supposed to play, analyzing its construction and limitations, even as she performs it with apparent spontaneity. The flapper costume she wears so convincingly is simultaneously her genuine self-expression and her critique of the role's constraints, a performance that contains within it an ongoing commentary on the nature of performance itself. By summer 1924, the Fitzgeralds have relocated to the French Riviera, renting villas first in Saint-Raphael and then in Antibes, seeking both the cheaper living costs that Europe offered American expatriates and the cultural stimulation of the lost generation. The community of writers, artists, and wealthy socialites gathering in France after the Great War. The Mediterranean light is brilliant and white, almost harsh in its intensity. Phonographs play jazz from neighboring terraces. The smell of salt water and expensive perfume and cigarette smoke mingles in the warm evening air. At the Hotel de Cap, where they frequently socialize with other wealthy Americans, Zelda begins her real education in what might be called bohemian aristocracy, a social world with very different rules from Montgomery, but equally rigid in its own expectations. Here she observes and learns from figures who will become famous in literary history. Ernest Hemingway with his aggressive masculinity and competitive relationship with Scott, Gerald and Sarah Murphy, whose cultivated elegance and artistic sensibility make them the center of a sophisticated international circle. Various titled Europeans who bring old-world manners into collision with American informality. The etiquette she must master differs completely from what her mother taught her in Montgomery. Be wittier than the men in conversation, but never more serious or philosophical. Drink as much or more than anyone else, but never lose control or appear sloppy. Embrace spontaneity and pleasure, but never work so hard at any artistic endeavor that you appear to be taking yourself too seriously. Dinner conversations, later preserved in memoirs and published letters, record Zelda's quick retorts, her risky jokes that sometimes cross the line into genuine offense, her ability to command attention in rooms full of accomplished and egotistical people. During this same period, Scott is drafting The Great Gatsby in the mornings, working in concentrated bursts to produce what will become his most famous novel. Bits of their life together, the lavish parties they attend and host, the sea and its ambiguous beauty, even specific turns of phrase from Zelda's conversation and letters filter steadily into his manuscript, transformed by his literary imagination but retaining traces of their origins in lived experience. Zelda, meanwhile, continues writing letters home to Montgomery, to friends, to family, and keeping diary notes in which she reflects on who she is becoming in this expatriate world, wondering in private writing whether she has any identity separate from Scott's wife and the flapper, whether the self she presents so confidently in public corresponds to any authentic interior reality. Her letters from this period, examined by biographers, reveal a growing tension between her public performance and private uncertainty. She describes the parties and the famous people and the beautiful settings with her characteristic vividness and wit, but also admits to loneliness, to feeling that her days lack purpose beyond supporting Scott's work and entertaining their friends, to wondering whether she should try to develop her own writing more seriously or pursue some other form of creative expression that might belong to her, rather than existing solely as adjunct to Scott's career. The narrator reflects that on the French Riviera, among the sophisticated expatriate community, refinement means improvisation and spontaneity rather than the formal curtsies and calling card rituals of Montgomery society. But the fundamental rule governing Zelda's behavior remains unchanged. Brilliance and creativity are permitted and even celebrated so long as they do not claim authorship or compete with her husband's literary primacy. The Mediterranean Sea carries his manuscript pages toward New York publishers and literary fame. Her notebooks stay in steamer trunks, their contents available for him to mine, but not yet recognized as having independent literary value. In 1925, having settled temporarily in Paris, Zelda began taking ballet lessons with Madame Lubov Igorova, a former dancer from the Russian Imperial Ballet who now teaches expatriates and wealthy Parisians in a studio that smells of resin and sweat and echoes with piano music. What begins as an elegant hobby, an appropriate activity for a wealthy young American woman with time to fill, gradually transforms into something more intense and consuming. By 1928, after the Fitzgeralds have briefly returned to America, renting a house called Ellerslie in Delaware, and then returned again to Paris, Zelda is practicing up to 8 hours daily, driving herself through exercises until her legs tremble with exhaustion. The smell of her own sweat mixing with the faint perfume she applies each morning is a vestige of the Southern belle she once was. Doctors warn her and Scott that this training regimen is dangerous for a woman in her late 20s who is not trained from childhood, that her body cannot safely adapt to the demands she is making on it, that she risks permanent injury. Friends who visit the ballet studio later recall seeing her feet bleeding through her slippers, her face set with determination that looks increasingly like obsession. Yet ballet offers something that nothing else in her adult life has provided. A discipline that belongs entirely to her, a skill that is hers alone to develop or fail at, a space where Scott's literary reputation and connections mean nothing, and where her success or failure depends solely on her own effort and physical capability. Each morning, she ties the ribbons of her ballet slippers with the care someone else might use for a religious ritual, a private oath renewed daily. She writes notes in the margins of her music sheets, recording corrections from Madame Igorova, tracking her progress through increasingly difficult exercises, documenting her ambition to perhaps perform professionally someday, despite knowing that her late start makes this goal nearly impossible. The discipline is punishing, but also clarifying. In the studio, there are no ambiguities about authorship, no questions about whose work is whose, only the straightforward relationship between effort and capability, between what her body can currently do and what she hopes it might eventually achieve. Scott complains in letters to friends and to his editor Maxwell Perkins that Zelda's obsession with ballet interferes with his work, that her hours at the studio disrupt their social obligations, that her single-minded focus on dancing makes her unavailable for the kinds of conversations and activities their marriage and his career require. Biographers trace the marriage's escalating conflicts to this period, recognizing that Zelda's determination to excel at ballet represents not just a hobby but a challenge to the fundamental structure of their relationship, her assertion of an independent identity and ambition that exists outside of and potentially in competition with his literary work. The tension manifests in arguments whose details are preserved in letters and later memoirs. Scott accusing Zelda of selfishness and neglect, Zelda defending her right to pursue something meaningful, both of them aware, at some level, that the conflict is about more than ballet, that it concerns the basic architecture of their marriage and whether Zelda can claim space for her own ambitions or whether she exists primarily to support and inspire his work. The narrator observes that the dance studio becomes for Zelda another kind of finishing school, but one that trains not for marriage and social success, but for mastery and perhaps even professional achievement. The more she writes corrections and goals in the margins of her music and exercise notes, documenting her progress and her aspirations, the more unstable the marriage's balance sheet becomes. The careful ledger of obligations and expectations that has governed their relationship since its beginning, increasingly unable to accommodate her insistence on having a vocation that belongs to her alone. On 26th of October 1921, in that St. Paul maternity ward where our story began, Zelda emerges from anesthesia after giving birth to Francis Scott's Scotty Fitzgerald, and in her drugged state murmurs words that Scott is already recording for future use. Her hope that her daughter will be a beautiful little fool. The remark, born from exhaustion and anesthesia, and perhaps from bitter wisdom, about the costs of being intelligent and ambitious as a woman in their social world, will be transplanted almost verbatim into The Great Gatsby, where Daisy Buchanan speaks nearly identical words. Decades later, literary scholars will identify this moment as a perfect example of Scott's method, taking Zelda's lived experience and spontaneous language and transforming it into fiction, the line becoming one of the novel's most quoted passages, celebrated as Scott's insight into female experience without acknowledgement of its actual origin in Zelda's exhausted postpartum utterance. By 1922 and 1923, Zelda had begun selling her own short stories and sketches to magazines, College Humor, the Saturday Evening Post, McCall's, publications eager for material that carries even a hint of the Fitzgerald glamour and sophistication. However, the bylines on these pieces reveal the complicated economics of their literary partnership. Sometimes they appear under joint attribution by F. Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald, sometimes under Zelda's name alone, and sometimes, most tellingly, with Zelda's name removed entirely and the piece published under Scott's byline, because editors are willing to pay higher rates for work bearing his established name, even when Zelda has written most or all of the text. The financial logic is clear and ruthlessly practical. Scott's name commands premium rates, so any piece that can plausibly be attributed to him should be, regardless of who actually wrote it. Zelda's name is worth less in the literary marketplace, even when the work is demonstrably hers. In private letters to friends, she jokes about this arrangement with characteristic dark humor, but the jokes barely mask a genuine grievance about not receiving proper credit or compensation for her work. In her satirical review of The Beautiful and Damned published in the New York Tribune, she makes this complaint more directly, pointedly mentioning the diary that vanished after their marriage, calling her husband's use of her material plagiarism, even while framing the accusation as wit rather than serious criticism. At her writing desk, in hotel rooms, rented houses, train compartments, wherever they happen to be living during their peripatetic existence, she continues the ritual of writing that began with thank you notes in Montgomery and has evolved into something more complex and professionally ambitious. The physical act remains constant, fountain pen in hand, ink, occasionally blotting on the page, her distinctive slanting script filling sheet after sheet. But the boundary between what is hers and what constitutes material for Scott's use has become increasingly blurred and contested. Manuscript pages lie interleaved on the table like a shuffled deck of cards. His fiction and her letters and their joint work all mixed together, the question of authorship and ownership becoming progressively more difficult to untangle. She continues writing, despite the ambiguity about credit and ownership, perhaps because writing is the closest thing she has to a vocation of her own, perhaps because she needs the income her pieces generate, or perhaps simply because the act of writing, putting her thoughts and observations into language, shaping experience into narrative, provides a form of autonomy and self-definition that nothing else in her life offers. The pen in her hand remains her most reliable tool for claiming some space of her own, even when the results of that writing are often appropriated, edited, or attributed to someone else. The narrator observes that the same sentence that charms readers in The Great Gatsby and becomes one of American literature's most memorable lines began as a new mother's offhand remark, spoken in a state of exhaustion and chemical sedation. In the peculiar economy of the Fitzgerald marriage, even an anesthetized aside can be harvested and converted into literature, becoming valuable literary property, but only when attributed to Scott rather than to the woman who actually spoke the words first. In October 1929, while driving along the Grande Corniche, the spectacular coastal road between Nice and Monaco, with the Mediterranean far below and sheer drops beside the narrow pavement, Zelda suddenly reaches across and grabs the steering wheel, attempting to send their car over the cliff edge with Scott, their 9-year-old daughter Scotty, and herself inside. Biographer Nancy Milford identifies this incident as a pivotal crisis, the moment when Zelda's psychological distress, which has been building for years through the conflicts over her ballet ambitions and her drinking and their mutual infidelities, erupts into active self-destructiveness that threatens not just herself but her family. Scott wrestles control of the wheel back, manages to keep the car on the road, and the immediate danger passes. But the incident marks a point of no return in their marriage and in Zelda's mental health. By April 1930, after months of increasing instability, Zelda was admitted to Malmaison Clinic near Paris for what is described as nervous exhaustion. When her condition does not improve, she is transferred to Valmont Sanitarium in Switzerland for more intensive treatment. Finally, on 5th of June 1930, she entered Les Rives de Prangin, a psychiatric clinic on Lake Geneva, where she would remain for the next 15 months under the supervision of Dr. Oscar Forel. There, after extensive observation and interviews, she receives a tentative diagnosis of schizophrenia, though later psychiatric assessments will suggest that she more likely suffered from bipolar disorder, her periods of manic creativity and energy alternating with deep depressions, and the devastating consequences of treatments, including sedatives and extended rest cures, that often made her condition worse rather than better. From Prangins, she writes long letters to Scott, to friends, to family members, the letters filled with impressionistic descriptions of institutional life, the rigid schedule that structures every day, gymnastics at 8 in the morning, weaving therapy sessions at 9, supervised walks around the grounds at prescribed times, bridge games with other patients at noon, endless hours of enforced rest that feel more like imprisonment than healing. Her letters from this period, later excerpted in Dear Scott, Dearest Zelda, and in the Paris Review, demonstrate that her literary gifts remain intact despite the psychiatric crisis. She writes with the same vividness and precision that characterized her earlier work, but now her subject is the strange, constrained world of the psychiatric institution, where every action is observed and interpreted, where spontaneity is discouraged, and where the pen she uses to write these letters is itself monitored as part of her therapy, the doctors analyzing her writing for signs of improvement or continued disturbance. The correspondence reveals a woman caught between acknowledgement of her own distress, she knows something is wrong, recognizes that the attempt to crash the car represented a break with reality, and resistance to the ways that psychiatric authority is being used to contain and pathologize ambitions and behaviors that might be understood differently in other contexts. She writes about missing her dancing, about wanting to write, about feeling that the enforced passivity of institutional treatment is itself maddening. The doctors interpret these desires as symptoms of her illness, evidence that she lacks proper insight into her condition. The narrator observes that the clinics promise stability and healing, presenting themselves as spaces where scientific expertise can restore mental health through proper diagnosis and systematic treatment. But they also formalize a new architecture of control more total than anything Zelda experienced in Montgomery or in her marriage. Detailed schedules that govern every hour, diagnoses that transform her entire personality into a collection of symptoms, case notes that reduce her complex humanity to medical observations written by doctors who believe they understand her better than she understands herself. The woman who once wrote flippant, subversive reviews of her husband's novels now writes lengthy reports attempting to explain her own mental state to psychiatrists who have the power to confine her indefinitely. The balance of authority completely reversed from the early days of her marriage when her wit and beauty gave her at least some leverage in social situations. Between June 1930 and August 1931, Zelda remained a patient at Les Rives de Prangea, while Scott lived in nearby Swiss hotels and rented apartments, visiting her under strict rules established by Dr. Farrell: limited hours, supervised interactions, explicit instructions about topics to avoid in their conversations, while simultaneously trying to maintain his writing career and generate income sufficient to pay for her expensive treatment. The cost of Prangins is extraordinary, consuming most of Scott's earnings and forcing him to turn out magazine stories at a pace that he fears is compromising his literary reputation, producing commercial work for quick payment rather than investing time in the serious novel he wants to write. Her letters from this period, later excerpted in both Dear Scott, Dearest Zelda, and in literary journals, are luminous despite, or perhaps because of, their origin in confinement and distress. She describes rowing on Lake Geneva during supervised recreation periods, the physical rhythms of the oars cutting through water providing temporary escape from institutional routine. She writes about the gymnastic exercises prescribed as therapy, about the texture of her days. Technical is her word for the strange emotional distance she feels from her own life, as if she is observing herself from outside rather than fully inhabiting her experience. Meanwhile, Scott writes to his editor, Maxwell Perkins, about the crushing expense of sanatoriums, about the difficulty of doing creative work while managing Zelda's illness and care, about his fear that the crisis is consuming not just their finances, but his literary future. The asymmetry that has characterized their relationship from the beginning now takes a darker form. Her confinement provides material for his stories. He writes magazine fiction about psychiatric treatment, about marriages under strain, about women whose artistic ambitions threaten domestic stability, while his stories pay for her continued confinement. The letters she writes in her careful, slanted script are preserved in archives as valuable literary documents, evidence of her ongoing creativity and linguistic facility, even in crisis. But the psychiatrist's case notes that interpret her letters as symptoms, that analyze her handwriting for signs of mental disturbance, accumulate in a separate file that will follow her through subsequent institutions, a parallel archive that frames her not as a writer but as a patient, not as someone whose words have intrinsic value, but as someone whose communications require medical interpretation. The financial and emotional arithmetic is brutal. She cannot leave the institution until doctors determine she is well enough. Doctors will not make that determination until she demonstrates sustained stability and accepts their authority. But the conditions of institutional life, the lack of privacy, the enforced passivity, the treatment of her desires and ambitions as symptoms rather than as legitimate aspects of her personality, make achieving that stability extraordinarily difficult. Scott, caught between concern for her well-being and resentment of the burden her illness places on him, oscillates between supportive letters promising eventual reunion and angry accusations that her breakdown represents selfish abandonment of her duties as wife and mother. The narrator observes that what began in 1918 as a romance conducted through letters, she writing from Montgomery, he responding from New York, their correspondence building a shared language and literary collaboration, has been transformed into a ledger of debits and credits, a transactional relationship mediated by psychiatric authority and financial pressure. His stories pay for her treatment. Her treatment generates material for his stories. Her words are still being harvested for his use, but now the words being extracted are not clever phrases and social observations, but descriptions of psychological distress, accounts of institutional life, the raw material of mental illness that he can transform into commercially viable fiction. Marriage here is not romance, not even partnership, but something closer to a management plan, a system for organizing and containing the damage caused by her breakdown while extracting whatever literary value can be salvaged from the wreckage. On 12th of February 1932, Zelda voluntarily entered the Phipps Psychiatric Clinic at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, Maryland, placing herself under the care of Dr. Adolph Meyer, one of America's most prominent psychiatrists. As part of her treatment, which emphasizes occupational therapy and creative expression rather than the extended rest cures she received in Switzerland. She's actively encouraged to write for several hours each day. Taking advantage of this therapeutic permission, she works with extraordinary focus and speed, and by 90 March 1932, less than 4 weeks after her admission, she has completed a full-length novel manuscript titled Save Me the Waltz, drawing directly and explicitly on her own experiences, her Montgomery childhood, her marriage to Scott, her obsession with ballet, and her psychiatric breakdown in Switzerland. Without consulting Scott or asking his permission, she sends the manuscript directly to Maxwell Perkins, Scott's editor at Scribner's, the same editor who has published all of Scott's major work. When Scott learns what she has done, his reaction is immediate and furious. He is angry not just that she has acted without his knowledge, though this breach of their understood arrangement, where he oversees and approves her literary work, clearly enrages him, but more fundamentally that she has used material he considers his own property. He has been working for years on his own novel, Tender is the Night, which draws extensively on their marriage, her breakdown, and his experience navigating her psychiatric treatment. In his view, these experiences belong to him as material for serious literary work, not to her as the person who actually lived them. Under intense pressure from Scott, mediated by Maxwell Perkins, who finds himself caught between his loyalty to his established author and his recognition of Zelda's literary talent, Zelda agrees to substantial cuts and revisions. Sections of her novel that overlap too closely with plot elements Scott plans to use in Tender Is the Night are removed or altered. Passages that seem to challenge Scott's version of their marriage or that present her perspective too forcefully are softened or deleted. The novel that emerges from this process is significantly diminished from what Zelda originally wrote, her voice muted in service of protecting Scott's literary territory. Save Me. The Waltz was published in October 1932 to largely dismissive reviews. Critics find it uneven, overly impressionistic, difficult to follow, faults that likely result partly from the aggressive editing imposed on Zelda's manuscript, but that are attributed to her as failures of craft and discipline. The novel sells poorly, barely recouping its production costs, and is quickly forgotten. 3 years later, when Scott's Tender Is the Night appears, covering much of the same material from his perspective, it is treated as a major literary work, praised for its psychological insight and its complex portrayal of marriage and mental illness. The stark difference in critical reception and commercial success confirms what the architecture of their marriage has implied all along. The same experiences, when narrated by him, constitute serious literature worthy of sustained critical attention. When narrated by her, they are dismissed as minor, marginal, the work of an amateur rather than an artist. The narrator reflects that in the Phipps psychiatric clinic, the ritual of writing letters and brief sketches, activities that have sustained Zelda throughout her adult life, temporarily evolves into something more ambitious. The composition of a complete novel, a sustained narrative that claims her own experiences as material for her own literary work, rather than as raw material for her husband's use. But this expansion of her literary ambitions is almost immediately constrained and cut back to protect Scott's claims on the same material. The architecture of their marriage and of the literary marketplace combining to ensure that her voice, even when she manages to assert it in her own novel, remains secondary and subordinate to his more authoritative and commercially valuable version of their shared experiences. By 1934, after the failure of her novel, Save Me the Waltz, and the disappointing reception of an exhibition of her paintings at a New York gallery, critics finding her visual art interesting but undisciplined, the work of a talented amateur rather than a serious artist, Zelda's ambitions for independent creative achievement have been repeatedly checked and diminished. The pattern is consistent. She asserts herself, produces work, and receives responses that combine faint praise with fundamental dismissal, critical judgments that confirm she lacks the discipline or talent for serious artistic work. In 1936, after Zelda's fourth major psychiatric crisis, Scott committed her to Highland Hospital in Asheville, North Carolina, a progressive institution that combines psychiatric treatment with occupational therapy, physical exercise, and creative activities designed to promote health and stability. She will spend much of the next decade cycling in and out of Highland Hospital, periods of relative stability and discharge, alternating with relapses that require readmission and intensified treatment. Scott, meanwhile, moves between Baltimore, New York, and finally Hollywood, where he works writing screenplays for Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, attempting to rebuild his finances and his literary reputation. He begins a relationship with Hollywood gossip columnist Sheila Graham, finding with her a companionship and support that his marriage no longer provides. Zelda, during her intervals between hospitalizations, alternates between Highland and her mother's house in Montgomery, returning to the family home where she was raised, now as an invalid daughter, rather than the belle who left for New York glory decades earlier. At Highland, she receives the era's standard psychiatric treatments, electroshock therapy designed to disrupt abnormal brain activity and reset mental patterns, insulin shock therapy, which induces controlled comas, various sedatives and medications whose effects are poorly understood, but that leave her with significant memory loss, persistent fatigue, and a flattened effect that makes her seem like a muted version of her former vivid self. The treatments are well-intentioned, representing the best available psychiatric science of the period, but their effects are often more destructive than therapeutic, damaging her cognitive abilities and eroding the quick wit and verbal facility that had once been her most distinctive qualities. She continues writing during this period. Letters to Scott, to their daughter Scotty, who is now a teenager preparing for college, to friends from earlier periods of her life, though the letters are increasingly fragmentary and difficult to follow. The effects of her illness and its treatments evident in prose that lacks the coherence and spark that characterized her earlier work. Yet the act of dipping pen in ink and moving it across paper, the physical ritual of writing that has been constant throughout her adult life, continues to function as an assertion of continued existence. She writes, therefore she is. The letters prove to distant relatives and to medical staff that she remains capable of communication and thought, that she has not completely disappeared into illness and institutional life, even as both steadily erode her capabilities and her sense of self. The distance between Zelda and Scott has become not just physical, he in Hollywood or New York, she in North Carolina or Alabama, but psychological and emotional, the marriage persisting in legal form while its intimate substance has long since dissolved. He writes her occasional letters mixing concern with exasperation, frustration with guilt, his communications increasingly taking on the tone of duty rather than affection. She writes him letters that mix memory of their early romance with resignation about present realities, sometimes lucid and poignant, sometimes wandering and confused. The effects of her various treatments evident in prose that can no longer sustain the brilliance that once came so easily. The narrator observes that the marriage as social architecture, as the carefully constructed partnership that defined both their lives for 2 decades, has dissolved into a set of legal obligations and financial arrangements, child custody considerations, and hospital bills. Yet beneath these bureaucratic remains, the fundamental pattern of their relationship persists. Her life, her experiences, her illness itself continue to be narrated, assessed, interpreted, and funded by others, by psychiatric authorities, by Scott, by the literary establishment that treats her as footnote to his career, while her own voice, her own attempts to tell her story in her own words, grow progressively thinner and harder to sustain. On 21st December 1940, F. Scott Fitzgerald died of a heart attack in Los Angeles, collapsing in the apartment of Sheila Graham while working on his unfinished novel The Last Tycoon. Zelda, in and out of Highland Hospital during this period, receives the news by letter rather than telegram, the message arriving days after the event, delayed by the mechanisms of institutional mail and by Scott's family's uncertainty about how to inform her. Now a widow at 40, she returns during her periods of release from Highland to Montgomery, Alabama, to live with her mother Minnie in the family home on Sayre Street, the same house where she grew up, where her father the judge once presided over formal dinners, where she once wrote thank you notes after country club dances. The architecture of her childhood now becoming the architecture of her diminished middle age. She attempts to write a second novel during this period, provisionally titled Caesar's Things, drawing on her family history and her memories of Montgomery society before the World War transformed everything. The manuscript, which does not survive in complete form, apparently explored themes of Southern identity and social change, using her family's experiences as a lens for understanding broader cultural transformations. She also continues painting watercolors, producing landscapes and still lifes in strange, dreamlike images that mix observed reality with psychological symbolism, the visual work providing another outlet for creative expression when writing becomes too difficult to sustain for extended periods. Her hospital correspondence from these final years, preserved in archives at Princeton and the University of Alabama, shows persistent flashes of the strange brilliance that characterized her earlier work. Moments when her distinctive voice breaks through the effects of illness and treatment to produce phrases and observations that remind readers of what she was capable of at her best. But the letters also show a quieter, more resigned Zelda, someone who has survived decades of psychiatric treatment and institutional confinement, who has outlived her famous husband, but remains defined primarily in relationship to him, who continues trying to create and communicate despite all the obstacles that have accumulated over years of illness and diminishment. One biographer, paraphrasing letters from this period, notes that Zelda expressed desire for some place that I can be my own self, a wish for space, physical, psychological, creative, where she might exist independently rather than being defined entirely through relationships and institutional contexts that constrain and interpret her. Yet by this point in her life, after decades of psychiatric diagnosis and treatment, after the failure of her novel and the dismissal of her painting, after Scott's death has left her more isolated than ever, such space seems increasingly impossible to find or create. Highland Hospital and her mother's Montgomery house represent her only stable options, institutional and familial structures that offer shelter but also continued constraint. The ritual of writing that has sustained her since girlhood continues during these final years, though in attenuated form. She writes letters describing the weather, the Alabama heat she remembers from childhood, the mountain air of Asheville, and the small events that structure her days. Meals eaten, books received from friends, visits from family members. These details, mundane in themselves, function as anchors grounding her in a present that often feels uncertain and unstable, as memory repair for a life that has been repeatedly interrupted by psychiatric crisis and institutional treatment. The act of recording daily experience in prose, however simple, provides continuity and evidence of continued consciousness, proof that she remains capable of observation and expression despite everything working to diminish those capabilities. The narrator observes that with Scott gone, dead at 44 from the combined effects of alcohol, stress, and heart disease, Zelda's story is briefly unhooked from his, no longer entirely defined by the famous marriage and the literary career that consume both their lives. Yet the fundamental structures that have contained her, the family home in Montgomery that represents both refuge and regression to childhood dependence, the hospital ward in North Carolina that provides treatment but also confinement, remain in place, unchanged by Scott's death. The question facing Zelda in these final years is no longer how to escape these structures, or how to claim space for independent creative work in competition with her husband's career, but rather how to make meaning and maintain dignity within walls that seem increasingly permanent and inescapable. In November 1947, after periods of relative stability living with her mother in Montgomery, Zelda returned once more to Highland Hospital in Asheville, North Carolina, the institution that has become her primary residence during the last decade of her life. On the night of 10th of March 1948, a fire breaks out in the hospital's kitchen around midnight, the flames spreading with horrifying speed up a dumbwaiter shaft that acts as a chimney, carrying smoke and fire from the ground floor to the upper stories where patients sleep. Despite desperate efforts by staff to evacuate patients from the locked wards, doors that were secured to prevent patients from wandering becoming death traps that delay rescue, 9 women die in the blaze, trapped in rooms they cannot escape from, overcome by smoke before firefighters can reach them. Zelda is among the dead. She had been sedated and was awaiting electroshock therapy scheduled for the next morning, the sedation leaving her unable to respond to alarms or move quickly enough to escape the rapidly spreading fire. Her body is so badly burned that it can be identified only by a charred slipper found near the remains, the insurance company requiring this grim detail for purposes of confirmation and payment of benefits. She is 47 years old. In the immediate aftermath, newspaper obituaries summarize her life with depressing predictability as widow of F. Scott Fitzgerald. Her identity reduced to her relationship with her dead husband, her own literary work and artistic ambitions mentioned briefly, if at all. The trajectory of her life presented primarily as tragic footnote to his career. The wire services that distribute her death notice to papers across America emphasize Scott's fame and literary reputation. Treating Zelda's death as primarily significant because it closes the final chapter of the Fitzgerald story. The famous jazz age couple, now both gone, their glamorous youth and their subsequent suffering resolved into the neat narrative arc that journalism and literary history prefer. Yet slowly, over the decades following her death, Zelda's own work begins returning to print and receiving serious critical attention. Save me. The Waltz is reissued by publishers recognizing its literary merit despite its initial commercial failure. Her essays and stories are collected and anthologized, allowing readers to encounter her voice directly rather than filtered through biographical accounts of her marriage. Her letters are published in volumes like Dear Scott, Dearest Zelda, providing documentary evidence of her intellectual sophistication and literary gifts. Scholars begin tracing systematically how often Scott borrowed her words, her experiences, her distinctive phrases and observations, documenting what she herself had noted with bitter humor. That plagiarism in their marriage had indeed begun at home, that his most celebrated work drew constantly and extensively on her life and language, while she received little credit or compensation. One letter from her hospital years, quoted by modern critics, preserves her determination despite all obstacles. I want to write, and I'm going to write. A declaration of artistic vocation that she maintained even when institutional psychiatry, her husband's literary authority, and her own periodic collapses into mental illness all conspired to prevent her from achieving the sustained creative work she desired. The line, preserved in archives and now frequently cited, has become emblematic of her struggle to claim identity and purpose beyond the roles. Southern belle, flapper wife, psychiatric patient that others assign to her. In archives today at Princeton, Alabama, and other institutions preserving modernist literary materials, conservators wearing white cotton gloves lift Zelda's papers from acid-free storage boxes, handling them with the care reserved for significant historical documents. The sound, as they turn pages, is soft but distinct. The rustle of paper, the whisper of archival tissue separating manuscripts, the quiet sounds of preservation work that ensures these materials will survive for future researchers. Her handwriting remains visible across decades. The distinctive slanting script, the occasional ink blots, the corrections and revisions, providing direct access to her consciousness and creativity in ways that biographical accounts, however sympathetic, cannot fully capture. The narrator reflects that the woman who once wrote flippant satirical reviews from hotel lounges, who sent irreverent letters from Montgomery describing provincial society with sharp wit, who danced too wildly and laughed too loudly and said exactly what she thought regardless of consequences, is now preserved and celebrated as a major modernist voice in her own right, her literary work finally receiving the serious critical attention it deserved during her lifetime but rarely received. Yet the fire at Highland Hospital stands as a permanent reminder of how easily a life, and the documents that record it, can vanish, how fragile preservation is, how much has been lost along with what has been saved. We began this narrative with a young woman in a hospital bed, blinking through anesthesia while her husband recorded her words for future literary use, the moment when "beautiful little fool" passed from her mouth into his notebook and eventually into the Great Gatsby, where it would be celebrated as his insight into female consciousness rather than as her own bitter wisdom. Across the arc of this story, the act of writing, beginning with carefully practiced thank you notes in Montgomery, evolving through flippant essays published in Jazz Age magazines, continuing in desperate letters from Swiss psychiatric clinics, and culminating in a novel drafted in just 4 weeks in a Baltimore hospital, has shifted its meaning and function multiple times, from social grace to literary ambition, from collaborative partnership to contested territory, from survival strategy to posthumous testimony that finally allows her voice to be heard on its own terms. In a museum exhibition today, one might imagine a final vitrine, a glass case in controlled climate displaying selected artifacts from Zelda's life, containing a single page from the manuscript of Save Me the Waltz. The paper slightly yellowed despite archival preservation, her handwriting still clear and distinctive. Beside it, a letter from Prangen's clinic, folded and creased from having been read multiple times. The prose simultaneously describing institutional routine and maintaining the vivid observational style that characterized all her best writing, and perhaps a photograph of Zelda at her writing desk, taken in one of the many temporary residences she and Scott occupied, showing her bent over paper, pen in hand, caught in the act of composition, her face showing the concentration she brought to the work that others so often dismissed or appropriated. The vitrine contains no extended explanatory text, no didactic label explaining the significance of these objects or arguing for particular interpretations of her life and work, just the artifacts themselves, arranged to allow visitors to look closely, to see her handwriting's distinctive characteristics, to notice the careful way she shaped letters and structured sentences, to recognize evidence of sustained creative labor rather than merely spontaneous self-expression. The faint shadow of her handwriting is visible through the back of the manuscript page, where ink has bled slightly through the paper, a subtle reminder of the material reality of writing as physical act, pen pressing paper, ink transferring from instrument to surface, the body's involvement in producing text. The pen that appears in the photograph, held loosely in her right hand as she pauses in thought, probably a fountain pen of the sort common in the 1920s and 1930s, requiring regular filling and maintenance, occasionally leaving ink stains on fingers and cuffs, was once simply a tool, an instrument for accomplishing the social and literary work expected of a judge's daughter learning to be charming in Montgomery drawing rooms, but viewed now, after following the trajectory of Zelda's life through marriage and motherhood, celebrity and illness, psychiatric treatment, and institutional confinement, the pen reads as something more significant, the only instrument that ever fully belonged to her across all the transformations and constraints that structured her adult life. It was hers when she wrote irreverent notes to Scott during their courtship, teasing him and critiquing his literary pretensions. It remained hers when she wrote essays analyzing the flapper role she embodied, turning her own life into material for social critique. It was hers in the ballet studio when she wrote corrections in the margins of her exercise notes, documenting her determination to achieve mastery of a discipline that might belong to her alone. It stayed with her through psychiatric institutions when she wrote letters asserting her continued consciousness and creativity despite treatments designed to cure her by making her more passive and conventional. And it was with her at the end in Montgomery and Asheville when she continued attempting to write a second novel and paint watercolors despite all the accumulated obstacles and limitations that decades of illness and treatment had imposed. The pen, resting quietly in the museum vitrine where light finally falls on her name rather than always reflecting primarily on his, represents not triumph. Her literary career never achieved the success and recognition she desired during her lifetime, but rather sustained resistance, the refusal to be silenced, even when nearly every force in her life worked to contain, dismiss, or appropriate her voice. The viewer standing before the vitrine must decide for themselves whether Zelda's story represents primarily the costs of privilege, the constraints imposed by being a judge's daughter, a famous author's wife, a woman expected to embody jazz-age glamour rather than pursue serious artistic work, or whether it demonstrates the possibilities for creative resistance that can persist even within structures designed to contain and silence. The light in the museum is soft, carefully controlled to prevent damage to fragile documents. The sound is the quiet rustle of other visitors moving through galleries, occasionally pausing to look at artifacts from literary history. And there, in the glass case, Zelda's handwriting remains, evidence of a life lived partially through words, testimony preserved despite everything that threatened to erase it.